Welcome back to Cinema Screen. Today, we're diving into a captivating 2001 psychological horror, thriller, and mystery film, The Others. This is a film designed to grip its audience and keep you on the edge of your seat. Be warned, spoilers are ahead. Proceed with caution and enjoy the journey. The story begins in the year 1954 at dawn, with a scene in a house located in Jersey, the Channel Islands. The focus shifts to Grace, who is awakened by a disturbing dream, causing her to scream in fear. A few hours later, three individuals arrive at Grace's house and ring the doorbell. Grace opens the door and asks them why they are there. The eldest among them, Bertha Mills, responds, "We came here." After which, Grace invites them inside, saying, "I didn't expect you so soon." Once inside, the three introduce themselves. The group includes Edmund Tuttle, the gardener, Bertha Mills, who will handle the household tasks, and Lydia, a mute young woman. As Grace shows them around the house, she reveals that the previous staff disappeared mysteriously about a week ago, leaving without taking their wages or giving any notice. She explains that this is why she needed new staff and had placed an advertisement in the newspaper. During the tour, Bertha inquires about Grace's husband. Grace explains that her husband left for war about a year and a half ago and has been missing ever since. She further informs the new staff that in the house, one door must always be locked before opening the next. Grace promises Bertha a set of keys to all the doors the following day. Grace also mentions that the house has no electricity and introduces Bertha and Lydia to her two children, Anne and Nicholas. She warns Bertha that the children have a severe condition that makes them highly sensitive to sunlight, so much so that doctors have been unable to find a cure. For this reason, every window and opening that could let sunlight in is covered with heavy curtains. Later, while preparing breakfast for the children, Grace questions Bertha about how they ended up at her house, since the letter meant to notify potential workers had not been sent due to a missed post. Bertha explains that she had worked in the same house years ago and came to check if staff was still needed. That same day, Grace is teaching Anne and Nicholas together, but the children fail to focus on their lessons. Frustrated, Grace separates them into different rooms, instructing them to study individually. During this time, Grace asks Bertha if Lydia has been mute since birth. Bertha replies, "No," and then leaves the room. Shortly afterward, Grace hears the sound of a child crying from somewhere in the house. Assuming it's Nicholas, she goes to his room, but he is quietly studying. Concerned, she approaches Anne and asks why she was crying. Anne explains that it wasn't her, it was Victor, who had been in the room a little while ago. Grace, thinking Anne is making up a story, questions why Victor was crying. Anne replies that Victor doesn't like this house, which is why he was upset. Later that night, Anne and Nicholas have dinner and head to bed. As Nicholas sleeps, Anne wakes him up, saying that Victor is pulling back the curtains. Terrified, Nicholas screams, prompting both Grace and Bertha to rush to their room. Nicholas accuses Anne of scaring him, but Anne insists she did nothing. As punishment for the incident, Grace makes Anne continue studying the next day. During this, Anne reiterates that she didn't do anything to her brother the previous night. The following day, as Grace is knitting in the house, she hears noises coming from the upper floor. Annoyed, she assumes Lydia is responsible and prepares to scold her, but she discovers Lydia is outside in the garden. Confused, Grace decides to investigate. On her way upstairs, she asks Anne where the noise is coming from. Anne points to the storage room. Grace enters the storage room to investigate. Inside, she finds everything covered in white sheets. As she looks around, she hears the voices of three people talking, which frightens her. She removes the sheets and thoroughly searches the room, but cannot find anyone. Disturbed, Grace gathers Edmund and Lydia to search the entire house, leaving Bertha to watch over the children. Before Grace leaves to start the search, Anne shows her a drawing she made, claiming it depicts members of Victor's family. She explains that the person she has seen the most often is an elderly woman. The three of them begin inspecting the entire house, removing the curtains from the windows to let in light. Despite their thorough search, they fail to find anyone. During this process, Grace comes across a photo album containing pictures of deceased people. Disturbed, she instructs Bertha to remove it. That night, Grace asks Bertha how Lydia became mute. Bertha replies that Lydia simply stopped speaking one day. Grace also questions Bertha about her previous time working in the house. After their conversation, Bertha retires to bed. Grace then visits her children's room and apologizes to Anne, but Anne refuses to speak with her. As Grace prepares to leave the room, Nicholas asks when their father will return. Grace assures him that he will come back when the war is over, and then leaves. Later that night, as Grace sits alone, thinking about her husband, she hears the sound of a piano being played inside the house. Alarmed, she goes to check and finds the piano lid open, even though no one is present. She closes and locks the piano lid before leaving the room. However, as she steps outside, the door to the room slams shut and locks itself. Calling for Bertha, Grace has her unlock the door, only to find the piano lid open once again. This discovery leaves Grace deeply unsettled. Convinced that a supernatural force is at work in the house, Grace decides to visit the village priest. Before leaving, she instructs Edmund, who is piling up leaves in the garden, to investigate a small graveyard near the house. She recalls that the previous owners mentioned it when selling the property and asks Edmund to check if a family is buried there, particularly if it includes a boy named Victor. As Grace leaves for the village, Bertha notices a gravestone partially visible among the pile of leaves Edmund has been gathering. When she points it out, Edmund hurriedly covers it up with more leaves. Meanwhile, Grace finds herself lost in the thickening mist as she journeys to the village. Unable to find her way, she is startled when she encounters her husband, Charles. Overjoyed and surprised, she brings him back to the house and introduces him to Bertha. Later, Charles goes to meet his children, Anne and Nicholas, in their room. That night, as Grace, Nicholas, and Anne are having dinner, a heated argument arises between Grace and Anne. The disagreement is about Victor and his family, whom Anne refers to as intruders. Upset by the conversation, Anne leaves the room in tears. Bertha, observing this, mentions that she too has seen these so-called intruders. Hearing this, Anne stops crying and begins listening intently. Later, Edmund, Bertha, and Lydia are seen talking, and Edmund asks a question to which Bertha responds cryptically, saying, "Grace is becoming a problem for us." The following day, Grace dresses Anne in a gown she had sewn for her and asks how it fits. Anne, liking the dress, asks if she can wear it a little longer, and Grace agrees. Grace leaves the room to speak with Charles and after some time returns to Anne's room. To her horror, she finds an elderly woman wearing the dress instead of Anne. Terrified, Grace demands to know where Anne is. Shockingly, the elderly woman responds in Anne's voice. Enraged and confused, Grace strikes the old woman, only to realize in that moment that it is her own daughter, Anne. Disturbed by the incident, Grace goes to Charles. However, Anne has already told Charles about both this event and another strange occurrence from a previous day. Charles questions Grace further, but she insists that she has never mistreated their children. Charles, however, tells Grace that he must return to the war. Heartbroken, Grace begs him not to leave, breaking down into tears. The next morning, Grace wakes up to find that Charles has left without a word. At the same time, Anne, who had been sleeping soundly, wakes up screaming. Alarmed, Grace rushes to the children's room and sees that all the curtains, which had previously covered the windows, have been removed. Shocked and panicked, Grace wraps her children in her cloak and searches the house for safety, but she finds that every room has its curtains removed, exposing the windows to light. Grace eventually takes her children to one room, covering the window with a blackboard to block out the light. She tells the children to stay there and storms off to confront Bertha and Lydia in a fury, demanding to know who removed the curtains. Edmund arrives at that moment, and Grace accuses him as well. Edmund explains that the curtains were removed to allow light into the house. This explanation enrages Grace, and in her frustration, she retrieves a gun. Threatening Bertha with it, Grace takes the keys from her and orders all three of them out of the house. Once outside, Bertha tells Edmund that her patience has reached its limit, visibly upset by the escalating situation. By this time, Grace begins searching for the necessary curtains to cover the windows and starts hanging them. As she continues this task late into the evening, Anne and Nicholas remove the blackboard blocking their window and sneak out of the house to search for their father, Charles. Meanwhile, as Grace searches for more curtains, she enters Bertha and Lydia's bedroom. While inspecting the room, she discovers a photograph dated December 1891 featuring Edmund, Bertha, and Lydia. It suddenly dawns on her that this is a post-mortem photograph taken after their deaths. Unaware of any of this, Anne and Nicholas wander through the grounds in search of their father. On their way, they come across three graves. Curious, Anne moves closer to inspect them and realizes they belong to Edmund, Bertha, and Lydia. Just then, the three appear in person and approach the children. Terrified, Nicholas and Anne scream and run. Hearing their screams, Grace rushes outside and, seeing the three figures chasing her children, fires her gun at them. However, Bertha calmly tells her that they died nearly half a century ago and that bullets cannot harm them. Shaken by this revelation, Grace lowers the gun and retreats into the house with her children. She locks the doors and instructs Anne and Nicholas to hide upstairs. She then confronts Bertha, who is still outside, and demands answers. Bertha responds, saying that the living and the dead must learn to coexist. Upstairs, Anne and Nicholas hide inside a wardrobe. However, an elderly woman soon finds them there. While this is happening, Bertha and the others inform Grace that the intruders have found the children and are waiting for her to come. Hearing her children scream, Grace rushes upstairs to find Anne and Nicholas in a room, surrounded by Victor's parents, an elderly woman and an elderly man sitting around a table. The elderly woman turns to the children and asks what happened to them. Anne mentions a pillow they used to sleep with. Hearing this, the elderly woman presses further, asking if Grace had used the pillow to smother them and take their lives. At this point, Anne and Nicholas insist they are not dead, but an enraged Grace moves to the table, grabs the sheets of paper, and tears them apart. To Victor's parents and the others, it appears as though the papers are inexplicably shredding themselves. Furious, Victor's mother declares that they cannot stay in a house haunted by the ghost of a woman who smothered her own children and then shot herself. Victor's father agrees, saying they will leave the house by the next day. Realizing the horrifying truth that she had indeed killed her own children and herself, Grace is overcome with grief. She embraces Anne and Nicholas tightly. Bertha enters the room and, in an effort to comfort them, speaks gently and even asks Grace if she could prepare some tea. Grace nods in agreement, silently accepting her tragic fate. As Bertha leaves, Grace turns to her children, apologizes to them, and reassures them with heartfelt words, saying, "I have always loved you both." Together, the three of them affirm that the house will always be ours. The next morning, Anne stands by the window and remarks that the sunlight no longer hurts her skin. Grace, Anne, and Nicholas look outside through the window to see Victor and his family leaving the house, having decided to sell it. As they walk away, the haunting tale of this tragic family draws to a close, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of mystery and sorrow. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more exciting movie breakdowns and see you in the next one.